Hello everyone, both those that I see in person and those that are online. I welcome you. My name is Rabbi Jacobson, and firstly I bring you warm regards, warm both physically and spiritually, from Jerusalem, where I just was a few hours ago. It's, just in case you're wondering, it's around 96 degrees there, am I right? But more importantly, it's spiritually warm. It says in some of the Hasidic books that it's easier to serve the divine God in the summer months more than the winter months, because warmth, which is reflective of the sun, is symbolic of a deeper spiritual experience. There's a verse in the book of Psalms that says, Shemesh u'mogen Hashem Elokim, that the sun and its shield and its sense like its filter, its shield, are an expression of the divine. So when the sun is in full glory, shining, it's a description of a more spiritually active and a more spiritually conscious time. Whereas in the winter, the cold, as it is by nature, coldness is more detached and more lonely, more desolate. And warmth is connected with life. You know, when we think of life and death, we think of warmth and cold. You know, a warm body, a beating heart, the blood running through our veins, and God forbid, the opposite of a corpse is something that is cold and it doesn't have a life force within it, so it doesn't have that vitality and the warmth connected to what life is. That's on a biological level. When you add into the equation the spiritual side of things, which is, in a sense, you think of a person, you say someone is warm to you. A loving relationship, you want it to be warm. When you hear the word cold, it's a sign usually of some type of disconnection. We say when someone's cold to another person. And in relationships, and not just in relationships between each other, but even with yourself, when we think of terms of an optimal state of being, is being passionate, being dynamic, being alive, and that's all connected with an element of warmth. So warmth is more than just a physical thing. Obviously, it's about really relationship. When you feel warm to someone, or they feel warm to you, or you feel warm about something, it's a sign of life. So the summer months, which of course is physical warmth, as I've discussed many times here, everything in the physical dimension evolves from the spiritual planes. Just like, for example, teardrops that come out of our eyes don't come out of a vacuum. When you feel sad, it evolves into a physical expression of tears. Just like a smile on the face is a physical manifestation of a feeling called joy or happiness. So the same thing is with everything in life. So in that sense, in these warmer months, even though on one hand, yes, people are more lax, you can say less spiritually attuned, but on the other hand, there is an element of deep spiritual energy in the air, and it's a matter of us tapping into it. So last week, I had the privilege to be in Jerusalem, and as I said, I was there for a week. I returned today. And I was, as soon as I got off the flight, since I have the Wednesday night class, so I scheduled immediately, almost from the airport, I went to Jerusalem, to the old city, and delivered my class from the walls outside of the Jaffa Gate. And of course, everyone recognizes one of the most famous places on earth, maybe the most famous. Definitely all major battles in history have been fought right there over control of Jerusalem. Until this day, it's still in dispute, and still in arguments. But you have the Christians, you have the Jews, of course, the Christians, the Muslims, and many other people in the world that come there, all seeing it as some type of spiritual vortex, a spiritual center. And from a biblical point of view, it's of course the most famous city, in the sense this is where Abraham passed by. This is where Isaac was there, Jacob was there. All this biblical stories that you hear about, even Adam's creation, and of course Abraham and the binding of Isaac on the Temple Mount, Moriah, and then finally Jacob and his journey when he falls asleep on the mountain. So I thought it was appropriate, of all places, to do the best place on earth is to do a class is right there. And the title was, What Are We Afraid Of? And I felt that it's a good, being that I'm coming back from that energy, and I'm still in Jerusalem time, Israel time, and that ancient part of the world, which is so stark contrast to where we are here in this world, they call it the New World. White civilization is only a few hundred years old here. And almost everybody that lives in this country, whether it's white or black or any other race, unfortunately, though, the native race was wiped out mostly. But all of the rest of us are really immigrants. We all don't originate here. So I thought it always puts things into context. You juxtapose it, speaking there about fear. And when you add into the equation that Jerusalem, the word Jerusalem itself, in Hebrew is Yerushalayim, which really means complete fear. That's what it means. It's made up of two words, Yira, Shalom, in Hebrew, which means complete or wholesome or whole. Yira, it can be fear, it can be awe. And so I talked about that topic. I got a lot of response to that. And it was for me, it was very passionate and exciting to be there. Here, I don't have the same backdrop. We just have a few bookcases with books and some chairs in Midtown Manhattan. But I thought maybe we can bridge the two worlds by trying to continue the theme and the energy of that idea also in this class here. So see this as a sequel. Even if you have not heard that class, you can always check it out online at meaningfullife.com. But even if you haven't heard it, it's a self-contained class as well, but it's also a type of continuation. So the theme that I addressed there was that fear is a force in our lives. Let's be honest. It's not for most of us, we don't see it as a positive. And in fact, it isn't a positive. Fear is associated with all kinds of negative things. Let's just start with the most basic fear, the most primal fear of all, which is the fear of death. Some of the Buddhists and some of the Far Eastern disciplines see death as being the fear mother of all fears, because once you're afraid of that, you're afraid of mortality, you're afraid of the end, so the fear of insignificance, the fear of being forgotten, the fear that your whole life is meaningless. The list goes on if you think of it that way. But whether you go with that type of discipline or not, with that theory or not, the fact is fear of death is, yes, a fear. It doesn't mean we live actively with it, but subconsciously it affects us. But of course, fear is much broader than that, because fear also includes the fears of just the dangers of this world, what's coming our way. No one can predict what will be tomorrow, what will be tonight. So we fear things. We fear the dark. We fear what the dark represents. We fear crime. We fear violence. We fear being abused. And then, of course, you go into the deeper fears, the psychological fears, the fears that are associated with insecurities, with fear of failure, fear of being judged, fear of not being respected, the fear of wasting your life, the fear of not finding your destiny, your soulmate, of not finding someone you can love and that can love you, and building a healthy family. And I don't want to go through every little fear. I think all of you can fill in the blanks and add anything you'd like to add to this. But I will say is that whatever fear that a person may have is all part of this term, this general description, what we're calling here being fear. In Hebrew, there's a word called pachad. Pachad sometimes is like trembling type of fear. So if you think of it in that sense, in the broad sense of the word, fear includes both physical fear, fear of the known, of the unknown, real fears, imagined fears, and it goes back all the way to the youngest of age. Children growing up, waking up middle of the night with a nightmare, or afraid of the dark, or some other type of fear. And though it's not spoken about a lot, fear is a force that really almost impacts everything we do. I would say the other way. It impacts almost everything we do. I said it almost impacts, so let's rephrase that. And it impacts, of course, decisions and indecisions. How many things don't we pursue, or don't we remain ambiguous about? We can't make a decision due to a certain fear. So that may be a more subtle fear. It may not be the fear of walking dark, middle of the night, and afraid of a criminal or of something dangerous, but it's nevertheless a fear that paralyzes us in a certain way. There are fears that are really more in the world of the subconscious, but we don't even know that we have. We just can see it sometimes in reaction when you start thinking, why don't I commit to things? What's my concern? So we may dress it up in all kinds of excuses, but at the end of the day, it comes down to some fear. And the saddest part of it, that not all these fears, I would say even most of them, are probably not even real. They're based on our projection, that we think that someone may judge us. We think we can't do it. And this often comes on a very basic level. Of course, this is psychology 101, that when you grew up in a home where parents were critical, where parents were invalidating, non-validating, they're parents who judged and always expected, you start developing as a child fears of disappointing your father, your mother, other family members. Obviously, this is not a healthy environment, but it exists, and unfortunately exists more common than we may think. There exists situations where children, instead of being validated and loved unconditionally and sensing that I can do anything with my life, grow up with all these different ghosts and second guessing and looking over their shoulder whether they can really do it and all that. And that's hard to undo, because these become attitudes that become ingrained in our beings. As I often mention the analogy, which I think is a really powerful analogy, of a warm ball of wax. So when it's warm, every impression that's made in it becomes etched in the wax. And as the wax hardens, you can't suddenly just get rid of that impression. So as children, we're very flexible, we're very malleable, we're very impressionable. And things that are said to us, I don't mean once, twice. We all have resilience. But if it's over a repeated time, it starts becoming our reality. And that's often where most fears are born, in an environment that is not fully validating. An environment that is, excuse me, an environment that's very validating and loving unconditionally. That doesn't mean there's no discretion or expectations, but you feel that as you grow, you're not being criticized. You don't have to perform and live up to someone else's expectations. You can just be yourself. Obviously goes a long, long way in shaping that warm wax, which is our personalities, our psyches, into something that will have that type of confidence. And that's what comes down to what we call self-confidence, self-esteem. So I'm really, really just drawing out the picture here, trying to paint a portrait of the entire spectrum. So you can be somewhere, and most of us are somewhere in the middle, but the one end of the spectrum would be someone who's really, their life is driven by fear, which means they grew up in a very volatile, unreliable, and inconsistent home. This is people who may grow up in children of alcoholics, children of abusive families, members, people who did not feel secure and safe in their homes, God forbid, but I have to mention it because it's a reality. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum would be someone who grew up in a home, an environment with parents, and nothing's perfect, but basically, primarily, they were given that type of encouragement and vote of confidence that you could do what you want to set your mind to do. So you can understand these two people are going to have very different type of attitudes to their lives. And fear lies at the heart of it. You can use other words, but that's the word I'm using here in this scenario. Now, most of us fall somewhere in between. To have a perfect, idealistic, idealistic childhood, or to have the worst, is not the case in most situations. We're somewhere in between. I would say leaning more toward the fear than toward the self-confidence. So if you think of society, you can't draw any generalities, because statistics here are very difficult to really gauge, because firstly, many people don't know themselves how secure or insecure they are until they're challenged. And secondly, most people don't want to acknowledge they're insecure. So very few people are going to say in its questionnaire, I'm an insecure, low self-esteem person. Some will say it, some won't. So it's very hard to really to come up with any statistics. And frankly, who really cares statistics? What we really need to know is for ourselves what the story is. What the matter doesn't help us if other people are secure or not secure. It's all about who we are. The only difference it makes is that today in a social media world where information travels so quickly, so the concept of misery loves company becomes very viral very quickly. So if somebody's like insecure, they make sure everybody else knows about it. So in a way, it creates a community of what we call the miserable club of America, or whatever it may be, or the lonely heart club. But that's only in context of the way things work in a social level. But in fact, for any of us to grow, we need to be more aware of ourselves. And I'm not suggesting you have to expose or even demean yourself to stating how much fear drives your life, but it's critical to understand how much negative thoughts really occupy us. And sometimes I ask people this question. It's not an easy question to answer. In the waking hours of the day, how much of your mind and your heart, your real estate of the mind and heart, are occupied with negative thoughts. Like, what happens if I fail? What will this person say? That and so on. And you'd be surprised that it really dominates often. Many more hours of the day are occupied with these negative thoughts and therefore fears than with positive ones. So we're going to address this topic and hopefully come away with some, I can't say there's no magic pills or tricks, you can't just change things overnight, but if you have a strategy, a modality, a methodology, you could begin to shift and change things around and take control of your life instead of it controlling you. And live literally with less fear and actually make decisions in a more effective way, in a more, what's the word I want to use? I forgot, but I'm looking for the right word. In a more forceful way and confident way, and grow in that direction. But for that to be done, we need to understand ourselves and understand the power that fear plays in our lives. And again, I qualify again what I'm saying. Fear doesn't mean you're sitting in a chair trembling, or fear doesn't mean that you're in your mind, you're terrified. We all know what that feels like. That's not the case. I'm talking far more subtle and less conscious fear that really comes into play. You just don't allow yourself to enter scenarios to make real decisions because you're afraid of going there. Some of us don't even go to a place because of that. I give the example often. If you go to a party or an event, so what's your natural state? Do you gravitate to people you know when you come to the party, or to people you don't know? So the answer for most people is they go to the people they know. But there is a significant number, I don't know the exact statistics, that will say, no, I like to meet people that I don't know. And that immediately tells you a lot about a person. It's not a judgment, it's not right or wrong question or answer. And it's not bad or good or bad. It's just a way of understanding what your personality is like. Why? Because people like to go where they're more comfortable. People I know are more comfortable. It's a comfort zone. Others like to meet people that they've never met because they either have more confidence. It could also be for other reasons because they don't like the people they know, but that's another factor. Or it could be because they actually have more confidence and they're more adventurous, more spontaneous, if you wish, and are looking to learn. And from the people you know, you already know them. New people are always going to be more challenging and so on. I'm not going to go through a whole analysis of this particular example, but it's an example where you can see where a person stands in regard to their own confidence. And the same is true with other questions like, are you likely to take on something new, or are you likely to continue what you've been doing? Whether it's in commitments and volunteerism and in your faith, in your religious rituals, or whatever it may be. These also are indicators often that even though, as I said, fear is not a driving force that you see visibly, because its real power is in its invisible force, but it affects things we do. Obviously, you see this in a very basic, another example I'll give before I continue, is a classic one where people have been hurt in relationships. Someone, let's say, is dated, because they fell in love or definitely got connected or attached to someone, and it was going well, and then something happened. Either the person rejects you, or disappoints you, or just decides it's not for them. So many of us get broken by that, hurt by that, which is natural. Someone you like, you don't want to be rejected. But what often happens as a result, what happens is next time we're far more careful. It's like someone who, let's say, God forbid, breaks their arm. So even after the arm heals, they're very careful where they go with that arm, and they're conscious about it, which is fine to an extent. But if you start protecting yourself to the point you don't want to date again, for example, or you drag your feet because you don't want to be hurt again, and this happens, that's another example how fear suddenly manifests in our lives. Now, as I said, fear has a good role because it's in a way, it keeps us aware of things to be wary of. But if fear closes us off to things to grow because we may have been hurt in the past, then it becomes a very negative force. I'm just using an example that most people can relate to and probably have had an experience or other of that. And many people have that. There are people, for example, tell me they don't want to marry and have children because they don't want to bring children into the world because they were hurt as children. And I say to them, you could reverse the trend. You don't have to repeat the vicious cycle. Have children and be good to them. I'm not confident that I can do that because I've been hurt. Who knows? This is not uncommon to hear. It's obviously sad. And with a person like that, you're not going to I wouldn't invalidate their fears because they're coming from a legitimate place, but you want to empower that person to figure out what to do with that fear and not let it destroy your life. Because what you're doing then, in effect, is you're with your own hands are doing even more damage than what was done to you by not allowing yourself the opportunities to be a good husband, a good father, or a good wife, or a good parent, and so on. But this is just one of many, many examples. And especially when we've been hurt deeply, when we've been betrayed in real ways. Real ways. I'm not talking imagined ways, which is also part of the equation. But in real ways, then we are very wary, and yes, fear is an absolute factor. So I think I gave enough examples to get the picture how this is really relevant to everybody. Because I don't think there's anybody in this room, anybody listening, myself included, that is not in somewhere affected by it, even as we speak. Sometimes obviously more obvious than others. Sometimes it's more blatant. But it is a force that usually affects especially where we experiment, how far we're ready to go to places, what we're ready to do. And there are many people who are very good party animals, and they love to socialize, but there's a wall up. And they keep that wall up, a very intense wall that maybe, if you're smart, you know how to cover your tracks, but it's still there. And that wall is a protection wall. Now, we all have our walls that we need for protection, but if the walls become so intense that nobody can enter and you can't get out, then they're just ultimately self-destructive. So this is all part of the discussion. So last week I talked about it in context. I touched upon a point, and it was a relatively shorter class because I was there at the wall, about the idea of fighting fear with fear, which is why we titled this class Fighting Fear with Fear. There, the title was last week was, What Are You Afraid Of? Talking about fear. But I introduced a very novel, and I would say even revolutionary idea to this concept of fear. Because usually in psychology or in therapy, you'll hear, how do you tackle all these fears that I mentioned, all the above mentioned fears or anything else, any other fears? So often, there's a few different approaches that therapists and psychological models take to this. One is trying to uncover what the root of the fear is. Let's say it is a parent's lack of validation, parent's lack of support. Okay, so once you discuss it and begin to unravel it a bit, you can slowly weaken its hold. That's one approach taken. Trying to get what is the root, what's causing us to be afraid. I'm not suggesting it's easy. Just because you can identify the root doesn't mean you can suddenly just change it. Because as I said, it affects us and has become part of our personality. You can't just tell somebody, you know what, your father expected all this from you and he never validated you and your mother did the same. So now that you're aware, okay, don't be afraid anymore. It doesn't work that way. But it's still a method that helps weaken, as they say, defangs the enemy by awareness. What we call, half the cure of a problem is awareness. If you're not aware, then you just may think, something's wrong with me. Or, it's nothing wrong with being fearful. Everybody's fearful. You identify the root, at least you know there's a cause, and that cause now has to be somewhat remedied, has to be somewhat countered, and that way you weaken those so-called concerns and help build someone's self-esteem. There's a second method used, which is how do you help people build courage in general? There are many fears in life. You walk down the street, anything can happen. There are people that are preoccupied with their minds, sometimes to the extreme, paranoia. I remember flying with a friend that I know. I would never have expected it. We were in a plane. We were going to a wedding in a different state. And I saw it. He was a person put together, solid guy, and all that. And I'm not talking about a kid. I'm talking about a person in his 40s. And when we were about to take off, he began literally to tremble. And he told me he's terrified of planes, takeoffs. He does it, but he's terrified. So I held his hand, and we got through it. And he gets through it. I mean, he has flown. But I was wondering, I said to him, what are you afraid of? But his mind, at some point, something must have triggered that planes crash, takeoffs are dangerous. And of course, you sit in the plane, a plane being up in the air like that, you're very vulnerable. And I was just on a 12-hour flight. If I could have spent 12 hours thinking about every possible thing that can go wrong, and there's no recourse, there's no net to catch you, But most people don't do that. Why? Because we know how to compartmentalize. We know there's always a little bit of a risk, but the risk is not big enough for us to be consumed with it. So the second approach is, how do you teach people to build courage, to not allow negative thoughts to dominate their lives, and think positively. Basically, think positively, be optimistic, and so on. So this is a second element to dealing with different fears that we have. But there's I'm sure within the two that I just mentioned, even many more other variations. I'll mention a few more as we go along. But what I introduced last week was something which was, I think, very different. And I would suggest almost revolutionary in that sense, and that is fighting fear with fear. Now, let's just use a few examples, because as I said, a number of people reacted to last week's class and asked me to elaborate on the topics I thought it's important to elaborate on. You have, for example, homeopathy is based on the principle of using an illness to heal an illness. That if you can extract the raw or the raw elements of a particular strain of bacteria, let's say, you can you can use it to heal the person. Interestingly, it has a certain parallel to antibiotics. Antibiotics is exactly that the different strains of bacteria, and when we learn to concentrate them, you help the body build immunity, which is why children get different what do they call them? Immunizations, right? Smallpox, chickenpox, measles, all that stuff, in order to build immunity. So the body now, the blood cells have recognized that bacteria, and that way, when it strikes, you already built immunity. They say one of the reasons as you get older, you have less of the common cold, because every common cold has its own particular strain of bacteria. And the older you get, you built immunity. You can never get the same cold twice. Once you take one type of cold, one bacteria, you will build immunity to it. So based on that principle, antibiotics was a real revolution of its own, that taking that strain and using it to build that strength and immunity, so we are then protected, which is an interesting twist. In other words, it's not about using some force coming from outside to fight an infection, but rather using the infection itself to fight the infection by building the immunity. I mean, psychologically speaking, it's not so difficult to understand. Before you face adversary, what you do is, if you can anticipate what that adversarial force will be like, and you can build up a certain type of confidence and strength, which is what basically we do in all types of training. What is training at the end of the day? Whether it's just training in an army, in the military, or training for a job, you're anticipating scenarios. So while the training is going on, it's not yet real, but when you train 10, 15 years, or whatever the amount of time, then the real situation comes up, you're ready. So in every military, it's something really, we spend 99% of the time is spent on training. It's for that 1% chance when there'll be a true war. And the same thing is with athletes, and any type of skill and any type of sport or any type of achievement. You'll see training is the key, because training prepares you for every scenario. And then with experience, now this doesn't mean every scenario will come your way, but when you, for example, see, let's just use sports as an example. It's a very easy example to explain. You see the tennis champions, and down to the final points. Even those watching it get so nervous. You start trembling. How do you imagine the person playing? How can they even serve without their hand shaking? And the answer is because they've trained so many times that once they get into the zone, they have a certain composure. If it's the first time, you can rest assured they're going to be nervous. And even later they're nervous, but you learn to have the composure and that type of serenity necessary. But that doesn't come overnight. You cannot teach that to someone. That takes years and years of training. So the same is true when it comes to fear, which I'm going to describe. But before I get to that, I want to just give you a source in the Torah for an interesting concept. This idea of using a bacteria to fight the bacteria, to use an infection to fight an infection, is actually a Talmudic statement that talks about an interesting concept. It gives an example of, it's an Aramaic statement. I'll say it in Aramaic in case any of you know Aramaic. Which means that to cut down a tree in a forest, you need the tree to cut it down. What does that mean? It means the handle of an axe is made of the wood of the tree that you're cutting down. The Talmud uses that as an example that sometimes to transform something, you need the thing itself to be part of your part of the transformation. It would be the equivalent, let's say, talking about war. The true conquest of an enemy is when the enemy themselves become part of an ally to you, because they know something, they know elements about the city or the intelligence that's necessary that you would never learn. So true growth and true transformation is when you can use even the negative as a positive. Another example for this is martial arts. Especially the Oriental martial arts. Many of them are based not on strength. They talk about like hardcore boxing, for example. That's pure strength. Obviously there's technique, there's also methods and so on. But there are some martial arts, especially certain ones, that are based completely on letting the power of your enemy to give you power. You let them drive you. In other words, when they try to punch you or they try to hurt you in some way or try to strike you, you let their energy either to strengthen you or propel you instead of you having to expend that energy. That's a particular art. In other words, you are using the enemy, so to speak, to propel you and give you strength. So in that context, this type of approach, from a psychological point of view, which I would say has not yet fully been developed properly, you can really develop all kinds of methodologies to deal with negative elements in our lives by using the negative element and its force against itself. How does that apply itself to fear? So I discussed last week briefly, and I'm going to elaborate now, that in classical mystical thought, or you can say biblical thought, the Torah Jewish thought, you have a universal principle which goes like this, that the concept that we have a relationship with God. However one defines what God is. But the relationship with God, sometimes you hear about loving God. You have verses in the Bible and so on that talk about loving God. But you also have verses that talk about fearing God. God-fearing person. They fear God. Now the word fear actually rubs most of us very wrongly, because fear is associated with much of what I said earlier, with negative things, which is part of why religion today is so unpopular and so rejected, because many of its ideas seem driven by fear, by punishment, by guilt, all the negative elements. All you got to do is watch a Woody Allen movie or two and you get the idea, the stereotypes connected to punishment and fear and retribution and so on. And the concept of love we find less often associated. But we do find words called, in Hebrew, Yiras Hashem, like I said, Yiras Shalom before Jerusalem. The truth is, when you say God-fearing, fearing God, it does not mean like the fear of night, or the fear of violence, or the fear of war, or the fear of criminal, fear of being attacked, obviously. Anyone that associates that with God is going to have a very negative experience, that we should think of God as like some criminal in the night that's coming to punish us. Who wants to associate with a God like that? You want to avoid anything like that. So to inculcate in children fear of God of that way is very destructive. Unfortunately, there are schools, especially religious schools, that often do that. The fear, what they call driving the fear of God inside the hearts of the students. Now, I don't think, maybe in years past, centuries past, when we lived in a pure environment and maybe teachers were more refined, maybe there were elements of discipline that required that. But today, it's not seen in a very positive way. It usually creates more damage than helps, because you're basically teaching a child to be afraid. Okay, so you're not afraid of God, afraid of punishment, afraid of discipline. And instead of teaching someone to love and embrace something because I like it, you're just teaching someone to just be terrified of breaking the law or breaking the rules because I will be punished or because I won't be accepted. So really, you're just creating a fearful person, and not in a healthy way. So then what does the word fear of God mean in a healthy way? So that's why I often use the word, instead of fear, I use the word awe. Awe. When you stand in front of, let's say, Mount Everest or Niagara Falls or the seven wonders of the world, or you see something incredible, the birth of a child, the magic of life, there's a certain sense of awe that it elicits in each of us. Or you look up into the cosmos, you see images from outer space. There's awesomeness. You read about the people who landed on the moon first time, and they saw Earth rise in the morning. They all describe the word awe. It was awe-inspiring. I was awesome. I was overwhelmed completely. Now that does not evoke anything negative. That, on the contrary, is a very positive feeling. So what's the distinction between awe and love? Love would be, I identify, I'm close to it. Awe is, I respect it because it's so awesome, it's so beyond me. But it's an uplifting experience. So when you identify in saying the awe of God as opposed to fear of God, that's a very different expression. That means that you have like the privilege to stand in the presence of something so much beyond you. It's like seeing the infinite that evokes awe. And this is people describe when they fall in love, the birth of a child, as I mentioned, music, art, transcendent experiences, that suddenly you experience something greater than yourself. And you stand in awe of it. It's an awe. It's even beyond respect, but it's uplifting. That's the key word. It's not demoralizing. And that's what I want to talk about, the difference. Anything, a fear that's demoralizing, is, rest assured, is negative. And awe, or if you want to use the word fear, so be it, that's uplifting, that's positive. And this is across the board with any emotion. And it's a very interesting and a very powerful litmus test. If you're feeling something, remorse, guilt, pain, fear, ask yourself one question. This feeling I have, this negative feeling I have, is it lifting me up and motivating me to greater heights? Or is it demoralizing me and making me feel like crap, making me feel like nothing, feeling unmotivated, causing me to just feed into all my own insecurities? That's a critical question. Answer that question and you're halfway toward growth. If it's the latter, then you can rest assured this is a negative feeling, and to dwell on it is just going to be more and more destructive. So you have to do whatever you can to get out of that mode. If it's the former, that you feel uplifted and you feel this sense of awe, this sense of overwhelming experience is motivating and drives me to greater heights, you rest assured this is a positive experience. And you should use it exactly as that, as something that can lift you to another place, to another dimension. So now let's take this back now to fear. You can fight fear with, as I said before, getting to the root of the fears, minimizing them, weakening them. You can fight fear by trying to instill or cultivate a sense of courage in life and things that you can feel confident in and so on. You can fight fear with fear. What does that mean? You take a negative fear and you counter it with a positive one. And I'm using the word fear intentionally now because once I've qualified, once you explain it, I'm not talking about the negative fear. Fear of God that's demoralizing, it's just like the fear of a criminal that's demoralizing, or the fear of some other destructive force. A fear of God that is uplifting, meaning fear of something like, like for example, someone saying, am I living up to my destiny? Am I living up to my calling? That is actually a very healthy, I would say, the word fear. If you tremble and ask yourself, am I living up to what I was created for, the purpose of my life? That's a motivating question. That type of fear is a very positive one. So, but now we have at least two fears. One can counter the other. If you try to counter fear with courage, or fear with love, or fear with some other positive force, they don't necessarily speak to each other. But if you can take a fear that you have and say, you know what, let me replace it with another fear which happens to be a healthy one. That is, like I said with homeopathy or with antibiotics, is like fighting the enemy with the enemy. Because you're using that same energy against itself in a way. Now I'm going to give some examples, but I just wanted to just state the fact. So this is a whole different story. That means then, instead of trembling over the pettiness or superficiality or things that you shouldn't be fretting over or frightened of, you can use that element of fear or awe and positive things. That will weaken other fears, because when you sense awe of something, you suddenly realize the fears I have are nonsense compared to that. Now, if you try to counter fear with other experiences, the fear can always say to you, okay, very nice experiences, but we still have much to be afraid of. But if you can turn that afraid of into something that's positive to be afraid of, that's another story. So another example would be, I use it sometimes in the context of shame. There's healthy shame, there's unhealthy shame. If you ever read John Bradshaw, He was in the early 70s. He was one of the first that coined the concept of the inner child. He himself was a pastor, son of an alcoholic father, and a lot had to do with shame was a big issue. The shame you grow up with, the shame of not having other friends over at your home because you don't want them to see your father come in a stupor and completely out of control. The shame that you have of someone you can't be proud of. The shame of the secrets involved. So he speaks a lot about shame. He's not the only one, but I'm just using him because I've read him pretty extensively. And how to build, so that's unhealthy shame. But there's healthy shame. What's an example of healthy shame? Healthy shame is, let's say you meet a lifelong friend, a childhood friend that went to school with you, and you were together in school for 15 years. And that person has really become something special. They've really taken their skills, their tools, their whatever it is that they have, and they've really risen to the occasion. And you meet that person and you look at yourself and you say, I haven't really reached that place. That's healthy shame. Why is it healthy? Because it's true, you feel bad about yourself, but it's in context of seeing someone that's accomplished and seeing, I haven't gotten there. And I'm like, in a way, ashamed of speaking to my friend because he's worked so hard to get to that place. That's a motivating type of shame. It's again, motivating or demoralizing, those two key words. So when it comes to, if someone has negative shame, why don't you start applying it to something that's positive, that does motivate, and you'll suddenly see that the shame will now be taken over by this positive one, and it will weaken the other one. I often tell the story of the previous Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. The next month is the liberation when he was released from Soviet prisons. This wasn't a small matter because the Soviet prisons under Stalin were not places that were prisons as we know them. These were places of death. These were places of torture, places of inhumanity. You know, I can't compare it necessarily to the Nazis, but not far off. But he was miraculously liberated. And among the different stories that took place while he was in prison and being at the mercy of his what do we call them? Captors, was that some of them were Jewish. And not only Jewish, they were once Hasidim of his grandfather. But now they were the most rabid anti-Semites. They were called the Yevsektia. They were the Jewish communists. And they were in many ways even worse than the regular communists. And they would have these conversations. One of them, the Rebbe insisted, even though he spoke fluent Russian, that he would not speak in Russian. He would speak only in Yiddish. For him it was a matter of pride and also a matter of his own self-respect and self-esteem. To maintain that, he would not cooperate with them. Now we're talking about life and death. This wasn't a matter of not cooperating and you have a lawyer that's protecting your interests. You're talking about completely at their mercy. So one of the captors came over to him with a gun to his head. In Yiddish says to him, Rebbe, you know, this gun here has changed many people's minds, has made many people cooperate. Time has come to cooperate. Who's in charge here? And the Rebbe, without missing a beat, unfazed, said to him with a loaded gun to his head, said to him, this toy, in Yiddish there's a word called tzatzke, which means a toy. This toy can frighten someone. It has one world and many gods, but not someone who has one God and many worlds. That's what he said to them. You think about it. Well, afterwards the captor said, I'll tell you right at the end of the story, so then I'll go back and analyze this. The captor said to the Rebbe, he said, we will see who will prevail. And the Rebbe responded again in Yiddish, yes, we will see who will prevail. And who prevailed? The Rebbe was released from prison. He ended up coming to America in 1940. I wouldn't be sitting here, most likely, had that not taken place. The captor, as obviously you can imagine, was shot probably in the next year, as everybody was shot, because Stalin ran Soviet Union with fear. You read all the biographies and all the stories of Stalin, it was all about fear. He wanted everyone to be afraid, from his wife to his children to his subordinates, all the way through the whole population of the hundreds of millions of Soviets. And that's what he did, and he did it very deliberately, made sure no one ever felt secure. A psychopath, unfortunately in a position of power to kill, as some say, 20 to 30 to 40 million people. whether it's through hunger or the other things that went on there. Fear. My father grew up in that Soviet Union, so my father used to tell me, he said, we went to sleep with fear, we woke up with fear. Fear, 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 fear. You never knew who's going to knock on the door. Someone's knocking on the door. Who is it? Can you imagine living like that? But that's what the Rebbe said, and he did prevail. Now let's talk about these words that he said. What did he say? Someone has one world and many gods. Yeah. You have one world and many gods, so a gun could put an end to your world, to your life. So there's much to fear. It's all over. And gods are negligible. No, gods are optional. You know, a god for this, a god for that. That changes. But someone that has one God, which means a steadfast, a powerful connection. Not every day another God. This is my God. And many worlds. So fine, you take away my physical life, I have spiritual life. You take away one world, I have another world. If you take away a second world, I have a third world. Diversification. You have many eggs in many baskets. So how could you frighten someone like that? And it wasn't just a cliche or a line. It was said by a person with a gun to his head that could have been shot, could have been killed right there. When you think about this, it really captures in essence why Jews are still here as a people. For thousands of years we've been under with a gun to our head, literally, figuratively. But our response, just like Mordechai's response to Haman, is everybody bows to you except I. I have a God to bow to. I don't bow to human beings. I am God's servant. I'm not the servant of God's servants. We don't bow and worship culture or human man-made products or money or anything. Now, when you think of it that way, let's talk now about these two things. If you are afraid of God, and I say a positive fear, obviously, awe of God, and God is your presence, you feel the presence of God in your life, which that means is you feel that you were put here on this earth. You didn't come by accident. You didn't choose to come here. I think even the most arrogant person on earth, if they asked honest questions, did you choose to come here? You weren't who, no one asked you. You just appeared. Now you're a big arrogant guy or woman, whatever. But someone put you here. And if you're cognizant of that, then let's talk about the other side of things. And so you have one God like that, there's nothing in the world that can frighten a person like that. The only reason, therefore, we're frightened of other things is because we're not cognizant of that divine presence. If you were in awe, and stood in a constant sense of positive awe of something of that magnitude, then how could anything that's temporary cause you to be afraid? You know, no one should be tested. But I remember hearing, even recently, just in 2008. And of course, during the Great Depression, that people lost their fortunes. They jumped off buildings. They committed suicide. I remember as a kid, I asked my father, I remember already, I said, how would someone kill themselves for money? There's other things in their lives. They have a wife, children, ready to do that to their families because they lost their money. So we understand that the reputation is connected to it, your credibility, everything you thought was valuable. So once a person creates a golden calf like that their God is money, once the God is slayed, there's nothing left for them. I understand it, but what does that tell you? It tells you a person has taken a temporary thing that no one on earth ever has mastered to take their money to the next world with them. Nobody has ever learned to do that. Not one person. The pharaohs tried to do it with pyramids. This one tries with cryogenic freezing, whatever it is. No one has learned to master the ability to take your monies, your equity, the hard-earned profits to the next world when you die. And yet we worship it as if it's a permanent element. That just gives you a picture. Now, I am not criticizing. I understand why people do that, because we worship the material. We worship the here and now. And the fact of the matter is that people will choose temporary comfort over permanent discomfort. If right now I'm happy, I'm happy. Very few people are going to say, I think about the long-term future. Yeah, we do so in investing and also financial, but that's how we are. So if you're writing a script that you're afraid, remember, at the end of the day, why do we hold on to things? Why do we hoard? Why do we collect? Because we're afraid we're going to lose it. Why are we afraid we're going to lose it? Because it's losable. anything that is temporary, can, just like it came, it can go. But a person who has that, and I say it hypothetically, we still have to wonder, how do we get to a place of faith like that? But let's first assume, like go into the Rebbe's shoes. Money meant nothing to him. Even his physical life didn't mean anything. Of course he wanted to live, but it didn't mean anything if he had to compromise his principles. What meant to him was eternity. He was connected to an awesome God. And that was what he was aware of all the time. So if someone came to him and said, here's $1 million, here's $100 million, $1 billion, it would not change that attitude. I know it's hard for us to imagine, but it's not that hard if you think about it, because let's take the logic of it. Very simple. Because all that money, or all the other things, are things that change. They come and go. What will it be worth in 1,000 years from now? What will it be worth in 50 years from now? So we live in a world where we worship and we value temporary things, impermanent things. That's a given. And therefore we're afraid of losing them. There you got a fear. What kind of fear? That's not a positive fear. But then you suddenly discover how to have awe or fear of something that's eternal. Imagine losing your soul forever. So most people would say, you know what? If you give me enough money, I'm ready to sell my soul. You have hundreds of stories, thousands of stories of people's soul deals with the devil. You know, in the healing world, they have a classic example. They call it the example of the another name for the devil, not the dark angel. There's another interesting expression. It'll come to me in a moment. Angel of darkness, maybe, or something like that. Anyway, this guy lives a life. If you're familiar with Oscar Wilde's Portrait of Dorian Gray, familiar with that book? So a guy lives a life completely indulgent, hedonistic, selfish, narcissistic life. He does everything for himself, doesn't care about anyone else, has hurt many people, has betrayed people, etc., etc. Think of the worst possible scenario. Then the day comes, he comes up to heaven, stands in front of the heavenly court, and of course, the day has come. He's had a lot of fun, but now day of reckoning, and the court begins to list all his crimes. Do you have anything to say for yourself? And he has nothing to say. What's he going to say? But since they don't pass a verdict immediately, so they say, go out, wait in the celestial chambers until we call you back. Now, of course, now he's feeling bad. He's walking around very despondent until he meets the angel of darkness. Okay, angel of darkness comes over to him and says, why are you so depressed? He says, I just lived a very, very selfish, pleasurable life. It was all about me, me, me. And now is my day. I'm going to have to now pay for the price. So the angel of darkness says to him, hold on, let's make a deal. Right? Here's the deal. What happens if I give you the opportunity to go back to the world, to earth, and relive your life? And what I want in return is your soul. Okay. So of course this guy says, he's a shrewd businessman, of course, and he says, hold on. Yeah, of course I'll go back to the earth. I'll do everything again the same way. On one condition, I'll give you my soul. When I go back to earth, I want you to give me my memory. I should remember this moment and remember what happens and all that. So I'll remember the consequences of this behavior. If I don't remember, then I'll just do it again. Angel of darkness says, no problem, sign right here on the dotted line. A deal is made. Your soul belongs to me. You go back to earth, you could do it all over again. And what happens? He's born again. Reborn, he grows up, he remembers everything. He remembers the deal, he remembers everything. And he does everything exactly the same way, even though he remembers. In healing, they use this a lot with with drug addiction and alcohol addiction, that even if we remember the consequences, at the moment you become so consumed with what you want to do, you minimize, and you say, you'll do exactly the same thing again. So, in that context, the fear of so-called, all the fears I talked about earlier that are negative ones, can be replaced. They have to be replaced with a fear of something that's eternal. Because the fact is humans will make a deal and give up the eternal for the temporary. Now nobody would like to admit that. If you ask somebody, how does that make sense? Very few of us will say, yeah, that's exactly. We'll say, because we're blinded. We're blinded, and that moment, that's all you sense. So how does that translate in people like ourselves? Fine, it's a nice story about Rabbi Jacobson. He had that power. He was a Rebbe. He had that type of connection. How does that translate? Translated is that we don't have to be on that level. But what we have to do is like everything. You weaken negative fears with a positive fear. And that does not have to be done cold turkey, as I said, in one overnight. It's be done slowly. The more you expose yourself to awesome experiences, spiritually awesome experiences, which, yes, I use the word fear, even ones that drive fear into us, but not fear, negative fear, fear of not living up to what we should be living up to, that, the positive, the motivating one, guaranteed that the fears that you have of other things will be weaker. That's this revolutionary mode. Fighting fear with fear. Not one fear with another fear, of the same caliber. Obviously, somebody told me once that they were going from the frying pan into the fire. They woke up in the middle of the night. There was winds out there and thunder and lightning. And they were really terrified, living alone, being at home alone with all those storms. They thought, who knows what will happen? Okay, but then suddenly they hear something scratching at the window. Uh-oh, a burglar. And suddenly all the fears of the weather and all the storms disappeared because the fear of a burglar breaking in was much worse. Okay, so that's fighting fear with a worse fear. I'm talking about a positive one. So I had an uncle who unfortunately was killed in a car accident when he was a child. There was once thunderstorms in the middle of the night. So he ran to his mother's bed, as a child does. The mother said to him, his name was Yosef Yitzchak, actually also, named after the Rebbe I mentioned. His mother said to him, what are you afraid of? He says, the thunderstorms. So his mother said, don't be afraid of anything but God. Okay. So he runs back to his bed. The storms subside. A little while later, the storm starts again. Again, he wakes up in terror, runs to his mother. Mother says, what now? He says, I'm afraid of God. That was how so the thunderstorm became. So that's, of course, just a matter of God causing the thunderstorm. But there's a similar story, which is really the root of it all, of the Baal Shem Tov. I think I mentioned it last week as well. Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov was a young child. His father died when he was a young child. So, as you can imagine, something said to a child like that on the deathbed of his father remained with him forever. What did his father tell him? Two things. He said, don't fear anything but God and love everyone unconditionally. Now, this wasn't just a line he heard in some class. He heard it from his father lying at his deathbed. And this became his... See, this is an example of a healthy environment, because his father left him with these two messages. And this little child was fearless. He would roam in the woods. People always marveled. Why was he not afraid? Because his father told him, do not be afraid of anything but God. And maybe connected to the second half, and love everyone unconditionally. I guess someone who has no fears can afford to love everyone unconditionally. People with fears are always judging others, and hard for them to love unconditionally. But that's not so much what I want to focus on. I want to focus on that statement. Each of us in our own small way, you don't have to be a Rebbe, you don't have to be the greatest. Each of us in our own small way can transform a negative fear through a positive one. But there's a condition. You have to introduce it into your life as real as those negative fears are there. The negative fears we have, whether it's the fear of being a failure, the fear of living up to expectations, the fear of being judged, etc., etc. All we have those fears. They're very tangible, palatable fears. What you need to do is how do you develop a connection to your soul, to your destiny, to your calling, to your divine calling, and yes, to God, that is equally palatable. And that requires a person concentrating and figuring out, what is my calling? Why am I here? And am I living up to it? If you ask yourself every morning, when you say Moda'ani, That morning prayer where we acknowledge, thank you, God, for renewing my contract, returning my soul to me. And you ask yourself the question, okay, what am I going to be doing with my soul's mission this day? How am I going to actualize it? And it should concern you, not just some type of nice mindfulness exercise, but it should really concern you that you need to find something in that day that actualizes your soul's mission and concerns you, guaranteed that it will weaken the concerns that we have over less or more superficial or less significant things. Because one concern will weaken the concern of another. That's how it is. That's the power of fear, positive fear. Now, if you allow the negative fears just to consume you, then obviously they dominate your life. What we need to do is introduce into our lives questions that challenge us. Now, I know the difficulty is no one wants to be challenged, But think about it this way. If not, you will be then victim to the challenges and the fears of the things that are very, very unhealthy and very toxic and very demoralizing. So this is the method. The method is to find areas where you are climbing toward. So instead of, let's say you're climbing on a mountain and you're concerned, how am I going to get to the next level? Guaranteed you're going to be less worried about falling. If you're just thinking, look how high up I am, and how am I going to, who knows what happens next? I may fall off the mountain. Rest assured, that's what's going to dominate your mind. That's what's going to dominate your psyche. So the key is to look at things of where have I not achieved in my so-called calling. That's called fear of God. Fear of God isn't just sitting and thinking, God's going to hurt me, God's going to punish me, God's great, and I'm so small. That's not the point. The point is the opposite. That you were placed here for a purpose, you have a destiny, you have a calling, and are you reaching it? And do it in writing even. To make it really tangible, do it in writing. What am I going to do today that's going to climb a bit higher in fulfilling my destiny? You have fear of that. And I'm talking about a fear like you would have fear of a boss who has expectations, healthy expectations of you. It's like, and all of us, we know that, whether you're you're learning music or you're learning sports or other education, you have a really good teacher that you love. And you're going to come to them next week and you didn't do your homework. You're going to have a certain fear. I'm not talking about a fear of a teacher who's punitive, who you're afraid of because he could fail you, or will insult you and humiliate you. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a mentor that you really respect. You know that you didn't do the work. That's a very healthy thing to have in life. It's called accountability. That's what it's called. I know nobody likes accountability. Trust me, I don't like it either. But it's the thing that keeps us honest. And more importantly, it's the thing that allows us to achieve excellence. You cannot achieve excellence without accountability. You could achieve greatness, maybe. Good, but not excellence. Because you'll achieve, with your natural talent, you can achieve things. You push yourself a little more and more. But accountability creates that type of 1 second. You did very nicely, but you could have done a lot better. Now, I'm not talking about beating ourselves up or in that negative way. I'm talking about, as I said, looking up. The story I tell often about the ladder that Tzemach Tzedek climbing up a ladder with the other children. The other children were afraid to climb to the top. He climbed to the top. And his grandfather, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, asked, why were you the only one who had the courage to climb to the top? So he said, very simple, Zayd. The other children, Grandpa, the other children, when they were climbing, they kept looking down. So they saw how high they were. They were afraid to climb higher. Like I said, look down. From a height, you get terrified. I was climbing. I kept looking up. So I saw how low I was. So it motivated me to climb higher. So the question is, are you afraid of falling? Or are you afraid of not reaching where you should reach? I would say for a person to come to recognize that I may not be reaching the potential that I can reach. I may not sing the song, the unique song that I was blessed with to sing. That type of fear guaranteed will weaken other fears. They have to. Because then your energy, your so-called fearful energy, is being directed toward growth, toward that type of reach. So standing in Yerushalayim, and even though I'm right physically here, but we pray toward that direction, I want to bring you the Yerushalayim energy. That's what I felt. You go there, beyond the people and the falafel and the other beautiful restaurants and the tourism, it's happening there. It's a big party. But there is, of course, a soul to Jerusalem. The soul maybe not felt by everybody, but it's there. And it has a history that goes back thousands of years. And it's fascinating that the name of the city is Yerushalayim. Not Av Shalom. Not in Yerushalayim. It could have been Av Shalom, which is full, complete love. It's complete awe. And I think it's because that type of element of recognizing of something far, far greater than us. So though loving God, as I said before, V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha, we say it every day in the Shema, to love God is, of course, a powerful thing because we don't just want to stand in awe of God, we want to have a relationship. You can't just have a relationship through awe. But the awe element is what creates the power to counter fear. Love is not enough for that. So maybe that's why we have that awe, a sense of, respect and overwhelming element. You go to the wall, and I think I've said this a number of times, I've written about it. You go down from the Rova, the Jewish quarter, down all those steps. So as you go down the steps, there's a point where you see the whole scene, the whole Temple Mount. You see the big golden dome of the Dome of the Rock. You see the gray dome of the other Alaska mosque. And then you get closer, you start seeing the wall. Now, particularly if it's on a Sunday, or actually for any day really, but especially Sunday, you hear the bells ringing every now and then. Remember, there's a Christian quarter, there's a Muslim quarter, there's a Jewish quarter. There's an Armenian quarter. That's another discussion. How the Armenians got there, I'm not sure. But, okay. Now, the bells are beautiful. They're angelic, the Christian bells. The mosques are stunning works of architecture. They're exquisite. And the wall is a broken wall. You find that it's not even the wall of the temple, it's the outer wall. The stones are not proportionate. Lower, bigger stones, higher, smaller stones. There's these bushes growing out of them. It's not really a nice wall, actually. I mean, it has its own quaint look. And I'm sure a poet and artist can make something of that. But comparatively speaking, it's like, at the end of the day, it's a broken shard of a magnificent temple that once stood there. And I find the contrast very interesting. The other religions, they celebrate the beauty, the completion of things, and we stand by a broken wall. So there's the expression I've mentioned a number of times from the Hasidic expression, that there's nothing as crooked as a straight ladder. There's nothing as there's nothing as straight as a crooked ladder, I should say. There's nothing as crooked as a straight white lie. And there's nothing as complete as a broken heart. So, of course, a straight ladder, who's the benefit? What makes a ladder useful is when it's crooked. So, crooked ladder is it. So, there's nothing as crooked as nothing as straight as a crooked ladder, and that's nothing as meaning as useful. And there's nothing as crooked as a white lie, a straight lie. Someone just a white-faced lie. And there's nothing as complete as a broken heart. You know why? Because we live in a world where there's still breaks and cracks. So if someone were to paint for you an idyllic picture, everything is perfect. It may be very appealing, but it's not realistic. Realistic is that we live in a world that has cracks and breaks and has fears, many things to fear. But we also are given the power to replace it with a fear that is a positive one. So when you go to the wall, at the end of the day, it's an awesome experience. Ask anyone who's gone there for the first time. And you say, what's so awesome about it? It's just a broken wall. It's not that beautiful. It's awesome because it's been standing there for thousands of years. It's like a witness to all the ravages of history, and it's still there. And you see the pictures of Jews standing at that wall. You have wood etchings, you have paintings, and now we see it. People from all over the world standing by that so-called naked wailing wall, it's called sometimes, the wailing wall. It has an element of awe. And if you think about it, but it's a wall that came as a result of destruction, a result of our exile, a result of a lot of pain, but we're still standing. So that's a perfect example of an awesome and even fear-inspiring experience that supplants and counters the negative fears. Because when you think of that, you say, here's a wall that's been standing despite everything that it went through. That is immortality itself. That is formidable. So when you think about the Jews, for example, coming out of the Holocaust, yeah, it makes your blood boil what the Nazis did. You read the stories. But you know, the real feeling, and I can't speak for everybody, but speak for myself, but I speak for, I think, the sentiment all of us have. The biggest awesome thing is not what they did to us, is that we're still standing. And they're either dead or embarrassed to show their faces to say my grandfather was a Nazi. We're still standing. As they decimated 6 million, 1.5 million innocent children with all the inhumanity, I mean, I don't even have the words. And they all evoke tremendous feelings of anger, blood-curdling feelings of how they could behave that way. And we all know if we were around 70, 80 years ago, we would have been one of those Jews. You would have no protection. Money didn't help, credentials didn't have, status didn't help, it didn't make no difference. They hated every Jew, and that's what would have been the case. But what's more overwhelming is that's the negative side. And some people actually live with that fear. Will there be a rise of new Nazism, new anti-Semitism? But there's something I think that's stronger, and that is that we are here. Despite all the pain, despite all the loss, the Jews rebuild their lives. And we have in Israel today millions of Jews. It's amazing. It's the size of the state of New Jersey. Just this morning, driving to the airport, I was thinking, just the drive to the airport, man alive, that's like itself a drive. That's like a lot of acres right there. And we've transformed that land, and Jews are proudly standing upright despite our wounds, and that is a positive awe, sense of awe that there's something that's stronger than any destructive force, and that despite all the fears that we did have, realistic ones that we had of whether it was Nazis or Soviets or other anti-Semites, we always had also a connection of faith. A faith is something that's stronger than all these forces. When you have that, that's the counter to fear. Now that doesn't mean we have to leave our doors open and we have to be naive. And even in the story that I mentioned about the Rebbe, that he said that this toy can frighten someone who has one world and many gods, not someone with one God and many worlds. Of course he wanted to live. Judaism is a religion of life, not a religion of death. We don't worship martyrdom or death. However, you can't frighten me with the word death, because I have something much bigger than you can ever give me, because no one can take something that they didn't give us. Everything in life, as I said before, man-made things, we fear. Because the fact of the matter is, no matter how much money in the world you have, money runs out. If not today, tomorrow. If not tomorrow, 10 years, 100 years, and so on. The Roman Empire was quite a wealthy empire, as was the Egyptian. Where's all that wealth now? Things run out, just like the gas in your car runs out. So the point here is to try to connect the things that do not run out. And they don't run out by virtue of the fact that they come from a place that is eternal. And that eternity is able to inform our lives today. You stand in awe of eternity and immortality, and you tell me, how could anything mortal or temporary frighten you, ultimately? Now that's good intellectually. The problem is we've been programmed, and we already have become part of our routine and habit is to be afraid of this world. That's what the problem. Our minds understand what I just said. Everyone understands. Of course, if you're connected to eternity, how could something temporary affect you? But we are affected because we're part of this system. And as Einstein and other scientists say, you can't change a system from within a system. So we have to hold on to something that is awesome or fearful from a greater place. And that weakens the hold of this world on us. Because that's our goal here, to weaken the hold. I cannot say we're going to suddenly be released from it. But weakening the hold, absolutely, every one of us can do that. But it doesn't happen automatically. You have to make a commitment to something, whether it's studying, whether it's praying, whether it's charitable, whether it's actions, or it's all of the above. Both cognitive, emotional, and behavioral conditioning focused on something that is awesome, something that's eternal. And that inevitably will weaken the hold of the fears that we have, whatever they may be. It's a given. And it affects, going back to the example I gave before, for example, fear of relationships. When you realize that a relationship has a third partner, God, so it's true you want to find a soulmate that's compatible to you, that you can love, they will love you, kind, sensitive, and all that. But when you realize there's also a higher destiny, it takes some fears away. It means, that people, everything works out on paper, but they think that relationship is only built by two people. Two people can make it, people can also break it, unfortunately. When you recognize that a relationship and the building of a relationship and commitment, family and so on is connected to something beyond the two people, it's a different story. I'll give you one example as a conclusion here. I remember a couple came to see me. I mean, it wasn't once, but they asked me to help them prepare for marriage. And they were a secular couple, but they wanted to do something. They wanted to have a wedding, a Jewish wedding, and they wanted me to officiate. But before that, we talked. I suggested some things to read, preparing what marriage is, what Jewish marriage is, the commitment. And I told them, listen, let me just tell you the basis of a Jewish marriage. How much you do or not do is your choice, but it's important that you know. You want to come in informed. You want to know what really makes a marriage really solid. Like I said, any structure needs a foundation, pillars. And there are three main pillars in any Jewish marriage, in any marriage for that matter. Of course, the biggest pillar is that the marriage is not just two people. It's two people, two souls coming together to some way change the corner of the world that they live in and fulfill their divine calling. So you have a third partner called God. And that manifests, I told them, Shabbat, kosher, the laws of mikveh, sexuality, taras mishpacha, and so on. But then I made a suggestion to them, which I always often do. I said, these are things that you can read about, understand the meaning of it, and they will basically infuse your marriage with something more eternal than just two people loving each other, which is beautiful, but it's still two people. And it's still subject to all the whims and ups and downs of people's temperaments and time changes and so on. You want something eternal, you need something that is soulful. And I made the suggestion to them two suggestions I made. I said every once a month or whenever you like, you should host something in your home, like a party, a class, an event, where people come together, not just a party, but something, someone says some words, maybe it's connected to Torah, it's connected to something that's spiritual. And you could rotate, different people in the community or different friends can do this. The second thing I suggested to them that every once a week, maybe Thursday evening, they should designate an hour, no matter what, to study with each other. To find a book, preferably something Jewish, Torah, something that speaks to them, they should read it together. And I explained, I said to them, because that way, in addition to everything, you're both going to get busy. You have things that you're creating that bond you together that are not just about going to a movie or going out to eat or watching a television together or something like that. Anyway, and they agreed. I mean, as I said, it wasn't a condition. I just suggested it. And they actually began doing it. Years later, maybe 4 or 5 years later, they got married. Everything was fine. But as every marriage goes through its tensions and its difficulties, they told me a while later that they got to a point where they were really they were ready for divorce. Things had broken down, their communication, this thing, that thing. Without going into all the details, it's not relevant to the discussion. They said the thing that saved their marriage was the Thursday night class they had with each other. They said things got so bad, we didn't speak to each other. We'd come home from work, we were so angry at each other. But since we made that commitment that Thursday we're going to study together, nothing else during the week except that hour that they did together. And they said that kept something going because they both were committed to it, not because one of them wanted to do it, the other one. It wasn't about preferences. They made a commitment. Sometimes they stuck to it, to their credit. They said that was like the beachhead that remained intact, and from that they rebuilt on their own, but they had that connection. That's a perfect example of a commitment, a type of commitment that's greater than you are, but that weakens the hold of other things that happen because it transcends them. And that's why I think Shabbat is like an unbelievable gift. Besides all the beauty of it, the fact of the matter is one day it's locked in. It's a day we're not going shopping, we're not doing the regular mundane activities. We're spending it with each other, family, children, or whatever. We're talking. It's more soulful. Just think about it. In this world that we live in, it should be something that's be embraced. It's so refreshing, simply due to the fact that it just like recharges your life. Instead of 7 days, the same again and again and again. So there are many more examples, but the point is, hopefully you can take some of what I've said and maybe weaken the fears that we would rather get rid of, with something that is, fill it up with something that you should really be fearful of. And that is, or awe of, maybe a better word. And that is your calling. What is it that you were sent to this earth for? And God is standing right near you and asking you every moment, is our partnership intact or not? I've given you life, I've given you blessings. Are you doing your part in using those resources in living up to your calling? If you stand in awe of that, even once a day or even once a week, I guarantee you, money back guarantee, of that other fears will get weaker and weaker. And it's a work in progress, so don't see it as, don't get disturbed if you have setbacks. It's a matter of slowly, step by step by step, and ultimately reaching that point. So God shall bless us all in this week of Baal Leischa, which if you want, I can send you an article that I've written about. So we have, in this week is the chapter, we say, Vahi ben Seah Aaron, when the Jews began their travels on the 20th of Sivan, of Iyar, 20th of Iyar, which happens to be also my father's yahrzeit. This week's chapter talks about their journeys, because they were traveling in a desert, in a wilderness that was filled with danger and scorpions and serpents and all kinds of lurking elements. So God said, you carry the Aron, you'll carry the Torah, it will drive fear into all your enemies. So there's a fascinating Kabbalistic thought from the Emek HaMelech, who writes that someone who recites this chapter, when they go on a journey, will prevent the fears and any type of harm to come to them, whether it's from thieves or from other type of harm. So I wrote an article about this a few years ago, which if you look up on our website, that's why I think it's also connected to this theme, the idea that when you connect to that higher connection of Yiras Hashem, which is the awe of God, and Yiras HaTorah, the awe of Torah, it itself weakens the fears and prevents any harm coming from other forces. So we have an actual technique, you can say, that's hinted to in this week's chapter. So if you send me your email, send me by email, send to our office a request, I'll send you the link, or you can just look for it on our site. It's connected to this idea, the Emek HaMelech. So with that said, let me say this, that we have all the tools we need to travel through this world, to face any challenge any challenge that comes our way, if we indeed connect to something that is greater than the fears of this world, and that's the fear and awe of the divine. With that, everyone should have a very, let's say, fearless week. Until next week, every Wednesday, 8:15, 8:30ish, we start the class. And this class, as I said earlier, just for the record, was actually going to be recorded, but due to God's plans, which did not drive fear in me, it was just on the contrary, you go with the flow. I'm here, so just mentioning that for some people who may have asked questions about this. And if any other way that I can be of help for the Meaningful Life Center, please stay in touch with us. I bid everyone a beautiful week. Thank you.